This episode of Lucky Paper Radio is brought to you by Simple Math. Studies have shown that only 4% of working professionals use the math they learned in grade school to do their jobs. With so few people actually using math in their careers, and computers and calculators littering the modern workplace, you might be tempted to ask yourself, why even teach children math anymore? Well, I'm here to say, don't ask such stupid questions. Without an understanding of basic arithmetic, Magic players risk punting away a game, making ill-advised attacks, or, worst of all, becoming a Tron player. Math. It's not just for blockers. Real quick, before we get into the episode, Anthony and I are here to tell you that our survey for Call Time is up and live. You can find it at luckypaper.co/survey/KHM. The link is in the show notes. You have a couple of weeks to tell us what cards you're testing from Call Time, and we will summarize the results and put it into a nice article, won't we, Anthony?
We will. We're going to make a nice article with a cool graph that'll let us look back on what are everybody's favorite cards and most exciting cards from Call Time.
And long term, we're trying to keep track of all the opinions that people are wrong about. We want to know your first hot takes so that we can look back on this data in the future and say, wow, everyone was really excited about this card, but it didn't actually pan out.
Well, I'm not as interested in that as just making a resource for people that maybe are not as invested. They're not combing through the spoilers like maniacs like we are, and just want to see what other people are interested in to maybe influence their own design.
luckypaper.co/survey/KHM. Do it. You have tuned in to Lucky Paper Radio. I'm your host, Andy, and I'm here with my co-host, Anthony. Ruined my whole game with the single Force of Despair Maddox.
It was worth it.
That was a very painful second turn in that game of Commander we played over the weekend, where I had my nice little goblin deck, and I had a land light hand, but I said it's okay because I can get this Warren Instigator into play and give it haste by sacrificing my Torch Courier, and then I can put two good goblins into play, get my Kiki Jiki in there, get my Goblin Rabble Master in there, and then you just Force of Despaired and 4 for 2'd me.
I think Force of Despair is an underrated card. To be fair, it doesn't usually play out very well in Commander, so it was really satisfying to see it work.
It's Black's best counterspell, I think.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And it's, we're playing to win, and just basically taking out an opponent on turn 2 is a very good way to win a game of Commander.
Yes, and you did in fact do that. You both took me out and won the game, so nice job to you, and kudos to Force of Despair for being the MVP in that game for sure.
Black's best 2-for-1.
Again, 4 for 2. 4 for 2. You don't people talk about 4 for 2s that often. 2 for 1, 3 for 1 sounds much more, really rolls off the tongue. It's a lot stickier than saying 4 for 2 or 5 for 3 or whatever.
I mean, 4 for 2, it's a reducible fraction.
Yep. Would you call it a 2 for 1 though? I mean, it was 2 for 1. That's different than a 4 for 2 is different than a 2 for 1, I think.
I'd just call it a good play.
It was definitely that. We're not talking about Commander on this podcast, though, Anthony, because we don't really like it. Instead, we're going to talk about Cube. And this episode is going to be about the density of removal, interaction, and other kinds of, for lack of a better word, like generic good stuff in your cube and how that affects how it plays. We're talking about stuff like removal spells, counter magic, cantrips, mana fixing, just, the stuff that is not going to kill your opponent, but is going to grease up the wheels and make the rest of the cube kind of work. And I've prepared a little bit for this episode, Anthony, so we'll get into this topic, and I have some notes that we can kind of go over. Before that, though, we are going to do our Pack One Pick One from a listener-submitted cube, as we do every week on Lucky Paper Radio. Our cube this week is the Junk Cube, which is designed by a fellow named Max, but was submitted by their friend, listener Quinn. Thank you, Quinn, for submitting the Junk Cube, and the description here, Anthony, seems to imply this is a cube full of intentional junk.
Is that fair, just to submit somebody else's cube?
I mean,
are we just saying this is fair game?
It's public. It's on the internet, so nothing to stop us from doing a Pack One Pick One from it.
All right, if it's on the internet, we're going to use it to make content.
So, yeah, this cube is basically just a collection of draft chaff and intentionally junky cards, all just kind of put together, which, I don't know, let's see if we can feel that from looking at our pack. I'm going to read the pack as I always do, and then Anthony's going to tell us what he is looking at for his Pack 1 Pick 1. The pack is Ranker, Blood Artist, Gateway Plaza, Lagana Band Trailblazer, Stitched Drake, Kasmina Enigmatic Mentor, Disdainful Stroke, Baleful Eidolon, Ashnod's Altar, Giant Growth, Gruul Guildgate, Vampire Nighthawk, Selesnya Charm, Ferocious Pup, and Mark of the Vampire. Kind of all over the place, Anthony.
I think this is a pretty easy one for me. I just want to start with Vampire Nighthawk.
Tell me why this is easy for you.
Okay, so, I mean, there are a couple other powerful cards in here. Ranker is extremely strong. Ashnod's Altar also has a pretty high ceiling in the right context. And there's 2 lands. Gateway Plaza is a gold land, which is pretty flexible, but it's a little bit slow. I think my assumption, just looking at the list, like, this is always one of the biggest questions about any format, is how fast the format is. And I think it's not that fast. So that's why I'm a little bit lower on Ranker. But I also don't see it as being like a format where you're going to get a lot of combos or like huge top end that is really going to make Ashnod's Altar extremely powerful. So I think Vampire Nighthawk is just a really safe place to start. It's going to do work. It blocks, it gains you life, and it's going to be one of the strongest cards in this cube, I think.
So you don't think there's going to be a really prevalent super fast deck, and yet you're taking the most potent aggro hoser, the 2/3 flying Death Touch lifelink Vampire Nighthawk.
Well, it also hoses, somebody who's just going to play a huge 6-drop, or, it's just a threat on its own. Is it really just an aggro hoser in your mind?
I think that is by far what it is most effective at. Otherwise, it's just, a Death Touch blocker is fine, whatever. Like, the lifelink doesn't really matter if you're going to be in a mid-range slogfest, I don't think, the 2 life necessarily. I'm not thrilled to trade this with like a 6-drop. I mean, if it happens, great, but I don't think that's the best use case for it.
No, but it's a lot of flexibility.
I would argue it's actually not that flexible. You have pretty much no choice but to play it, and then your opponent is actually given the flexibility. How do I attack into this? When do I attack into this? Do I use a removal spell on this? Like, you put your opponent in a hard spot by having a creature that can block anything and kill it, and if left unchecked, just gain you some life over a few turns. But you actually don't have any flexibility, really, as the person playing the Vampire Nighthawk, I would argue.
All right, so where are you starting then?
I think in this cube, the cards that jump out to me as powerful cards in this pack, I think Kasmina is a very strong contender for the most powerful card in this pack. I agree with you, Anthony. I do not expect games to be super quick here, and I'm not expecting tempo to be super duper relevant. And so in this pack, we have really just the one clear 2-for-1, and it's Kasmina. And arguably, it's a little more than a 2-for-1. You get, 2/2/2 wizards under most circumstances, and also get this Planeswalker left behind with this static ability. And you get to loot twice. Like, it's just a lot going on Kasmina. So Kasmina is the non-land card that jumps out at me. And the other reason I like her here is because she's just 1 pip of devotion. I would really not be excited to commit to a double black card like Vampire Nighthawk, pack 1, pick 1 in this cube, because what I assume I'm going to be trying to do is play a slightly greedier deck, at least 2 colors in a splash, maybe a full 3 colors. And after Kasmina, I'm looking at the lands, just Gateway Plaza or Gruul Guildgate. And I'd probably start on Gateway Plaza just because it produces any color of mana, which is nice in terms of keeping me open. So really, it's Kasmina and Gateway Plaza for me that I'm kind of picking between. I don't like Ashnod's Altar here. I don't really like that card in Cube in general because I think it's very hard to get a card's worth of value out of it. It costs 3 mana, so I really am not happy with the mana exchange until I sacrifice 2 creatures to it to get 4 mana, and then now I'm down 3 cards that I have to use that 4 mana and that sort of tempo to make up for the fact that I'm down 3 cards. Like, absent combos and very sort of intense synergies, I'm really not into Ashnod's Altar either. So those are the cards I'm looking at.
That's fair. I mean, Kasmina always does perform a little bit better than I expected to.
Kasmina's great.
Like,
it's a really strong card.
The static ability, which looks kind of like a throwaway line, really isn't.
I agree. I think that static ability is quite relevant in a lot of games. So yeah, that's what I'm looking at. I think I would just take Kasmina here and start prioritizing lands after that, and depending on what I was past.
I see your perspective, even if it's not what I would do.
So you're still on Nighthawk?
I think so.
All right, fair enough. This show's only interesting when we disagree, so Anthony's on Vampire Nighthawk, I'm on Kasmina. Thank you, Quinn, for sending in this cube, and thank you, Max, for designing this cube, and hopefully you don't mind that we did it. You used your cube to make content, which is are right as denizens of the internet.
I love this cube though. I mean, it's they call it the junk cube, and it's full of draft chaff. But like, draft is fun because it's made of all these cards that interact with each other. It doesn't really matter that they are bad cards in other contexts.
Yeah, I definitely like. I think Cube is a place where otherwise bad cards can really shine because you can just play with what you have. And we were talking last night. We were on a stream last night with JJ from Cube Outside the Box, and we were talking about how one of the nice things about Cube is that you can force your players to play with any card you want, which sounds like a weird power trip. But what I mean is that like the cards that are in the cube are the ones that are going to get played. And so if you want to play cards that are lower power level or just the cards you have around, like just put them in a cube and they'll get play out of them, which I think is pretty fun. And yeah, based on the description of draft chaff here, I'm assuming this cube is put together of cards that Max just had laying around and kind of threw them into a cube. And I think that's great. I love building a cube for that reason and just playing the cards. And there's a lot of forgiveness, I think, in cube design. Like, by Max's own description, we are maybe left to assume that there hasn't been a lot of thought put into exactly the balance of different kinds of effects or perfectly power balancing the cube and trying to like ruthlessly cut power outliers on the sort of top and bottom of the power curve. And that's all fine because that's what is true of regular retail limited draft. And that's fun. Magic's fun. So yeah, I'm into it.
It's also called the Junk Cube, but I think this is an Alpha Llanowar Elves in here.
It does appear to be an Alpha Llanowar Elves. Who knows how accurate the versions are? I'm guessing accurate because they seem very specifically chosen. I had to test my memory because the Casmina Enigmatic Mentor is Japanese, and so I just, without having the card in front of me, had to remember what it did and what it was. But big gold section here. It seems like some pet cards possibly. I'm noticing the full ring cycle: Ring of Evos Isle, Ring of Caledonia, Ring of Thune, which are these weird equipments that benefit creatures a little bit and then give an additional benefit to creatures of a specific color, which is kind of a funky cycle to see included in here. So I'm assuming some kind of pet card, perhaps. Cube's Cube, 81 gold cards. I mean, if you like gold cards, Anthony, so I know you love seeing that.
Oh, absolutely.
Anyway, you can have your cube on Lucky Paper Radio or your friend's cube if it's publicly available on Cube Cobra. We don't care whose cube you send us. If you want us to do a pack one, pick one from any cube, just send us the link to mail@luckypaper.co, include your name and pronouns, and if you know the designer's name and pronouns, do the same, and we will do it on our show. Anthony, I was eager to get through that pack one, pick one, no offense to Max or Quinn, because I'm excited about our topic this week. I feel like this is going to be an all-timer, one of our really good episodes.
All right, setting the bar high. That's dangerous.
Do you, Anthony, have any idea what percentage of your cube is removal or counter magic, or I kind of lumped all of the card draw and cantrips and stuff under smoothing. Do you have any ideas like what those percentages are? Have you ever thought about that with your cube?
I have. I want to say it's around 23%. I'm kind of going by memory, but I know I have added it up and done the math at some point.
Which one of those things is around 23%?
Removal and interaction. So, including also things like bounce spells and Man of War, stuff like that.
Now, did you pick that percentage and say, like, this is the percentage of removal and interaction I would like to have? Or did you design the cube and then add it up afterwards and say, like, sure, 23 sounds good?
When I was initially designing the cube, that was definitely an axis or like a number that I wanted to understand more. Like that was really one of the questions I had of other cube designers was like, where should this number be in order to get the kind of gameplay I'm interested in? And I didn't really get a concrete answer. I mean, I looked at some other cubes and tried to sort of like suss that out myself. But really it sort of landed there through playtesting and iteration.
I have never actually thought about my own cube in these terms at all. I had no idea what percentage of my cube was hard removal and soft removal. And spoiler, I have run all these numbers and done all this math for both of our main cubes so we can talk about how they compare and how they actually impact the environments on this episode today. I had no idea because I think even doing this exercise is a little bit fraught for a couple of reasons. One of the reasons being that a lot of these cards are very hard to categorize. I have a hard removal and soft removal categories that I counted up here for our two cubes, and even just deciding if a card is hard removal or soft removal is pretty difficult. Do you count an Oblivion Ring as hard removal or soft removal? If it removes anything, but it also can be undone, not terribly difficultly. And balance. Is balance hard removal, soft removal? Like, it can remove anything, but also only if you have a certain board. Like, there's weird sort of arbitrary ways you try to draw these lines, which makes it difficult. So that's one reason I've never really taken it super seriously, because it's like, well, even if I knew there was some optimal number of removal spells or whatever, like what do I count as a removal spell, and how far does it, how conditional, how expensive, how whatever does it have to be before I no longer count it as a removal spell? And then the other thing, that's maybe the bigger thing for me, is that I don't ever want to give the impression that there is like an ideal template for a cube. And I feel like people oftentimes, when they're new to cube design, ask these questions like, oh, how much removal are you running? And they could be asking the question in the context of, I would like to have a benchmark. I want to see like kind of what the range is or whatever. But the context I always feel like is sort of implied is, tell me what the right amount of removal to run in my cube is. And the answer is, there is no right number. It depends entirely on your goals and what you define as removal and what kind of gameplay you want to encourage.
Yeah, I mean, it really comes down to playtesting as like the only way that you can actually answer a lot of these questions, but I do think there is value in having that template as a starting point. But to your point, it can definitely come off in the wrong way, where it doesn't just sound like a starting point, but it sounds like it is in some way correct.
Right. So I'm gonna read all these numbers eventually on this show, but I do want to emphasize up front that I don't think any of these numbers are objectively better or right or correct or anything like that. This is just how these numbers happen to have broken down. And again, for my own cube, I've never ever run these numbers, never thought about them, never tried to hit some benchmark of, let me get to a certain percentage of counter magic or whatever. And the reason is because, my cube started as, kind of the way that our listeners submitted Pack 1 Pick 1 cube started. It was just a bunch of cards that were left in my trade binder that didn't fit in my EDH decks at the time. I wasn't playing any constructed magic. I just had no use for these cards, but I liked them. I wanted to play them somewhere. And so that's what my cube started as. And then over time, I've really kind of focused on optimizing my cube for power level within my set of restrictions. So, we've talked about how my cube is one of these like typical cubes you see a lot of people have, where it's playing a lot of the common archetypes. The green deck has a bunch of mana dorks, the blue deck's full of counter magic. There's aggro in white and red and a little bit in black. It's some of the sort of the murderer's row of common cube archetypes. And I also basically aim to play like the best. I aim to make aggro, mid-range, and control as good as they possibly can be in my environment, and play the cards that will enable that as much as possible. And so because that's my goal, my density of removal is not dictated by how much removal I think an environment needs. It's entirely dictated by how many removal spells are good enough for me to run, right? Like how many are there in existence that are powerful enough and meet my restrictions and meet my values to actually fit in this cube. And that's kind of how I arrived at these numbers, and obviously playtesting and things like that. But I never ever had like a piece of feedback from playtesting where I was like, "Ooh, I better cut down on the removal or add more removal." Like that was never a thing that ever came up in my playtesting.
That's a sort of aside from what you're or implied in what you're saying is that when you're optimizing for power level, you're kind of forcing yourself to have your cube be dictated just by like the cards that exist. Like I think an example that always stands out as being very weird to me is that a lot of people have both Oblivion Ring and Banishing Light in their cube, and it's not because they really think, well, we need two of this effect. It's just that they happen to, like, for technical, like, mechanical reasons about how the game works, created a second iteration of that card because they sort of like saw some problems with it. And it sort of sounds like what you're encountering with the removal. It's just like, well, this is the amount of removal because that's the card pool that's available, and there's not really a lot of flexibility there.
Pretty much. And I think it's worth mentioning this because I only really had this realization because I've been designing some other cubes. We've talked about in passing some other cubes I've designed that are very different goals. I designed a combat trick focus cube. We actually play tested a couple weeks ago. I'm working right now on a changeling tribal cube that's kind of built around the new changelings from Kaldheim and a lot of sort of esoteric, weird tribal cards. And in these environments, the focus, right? The focus of the cube, the reason for its existence is some category of cards. In the combat trick cubes instance, it's good combat tricks and all these cards that care about being targeted by spells, care about their power, care about, those kinds of things so that I actually can benefit from these combat tricks in weird ways. And in the changeling cube, it's all about basically, like I said, these changelings and then weird tribal payoff cards that you can combine in strange ways because the changelings are all tribes. But there's no existing, I'm right up against this question of how much non-thematic, just like normal magic stuff do I put in here? How much removal? How much counter magic? How many cantrips? Those kinds of questions. And obviously, there are some of these cards that fit into both categories, right? There are some tribal cards that are removal, or there are some combat tricks that do draw cards, so they do help you with your smoothing of your hand in game. But there's also, I think, a shortage of those, and you have to just run a certain amount. And that's a question I was sort of run up against. And so it's really the first time I realized what I think is a very clear distinction in two different approaches to cube design. One where it's like, I'm playing the best, best is completely relative and subjective, but I'm playing the best cards I can within my, restrictions, and I'm trying to make my cube perform that way. And I think if you're making a cube that way, like my main cube is, then you're not really thinking about these ratios, because I will cut a 3-drop creature for a new removal spell if a new good removal spell is printed that I really like and think is of the appropriate power level for my cube, and there's a 3-drop that has been on the bottom of my sort of list for a long time. I don't care about color balance or sort of spreadsheet aesthetics, so I don't have like defined slots in my cube. When I make changes for a new set, these percentages all change because I don't care or think about them. I don't really process my cube that way. Versus someone like your regular cube, which is at a lower power level, and you had to make a very conscious decision about how much removal am I going to put in here, because you had access to tons of it. Hundreds of cards probably are removal and of appropriate power level to sort of fit in your cube. Or anybody that's making a cube that's more thematic, more focused on something other than trying to optimize for a certain type of very specific high-powered gameplay. I just think it's interesting that there's those two very different approaches to designing a cube, which I think probably most cubes, and any cube designer that only has one cube, for those cube designers, fall into these two categories, and I think it probably dictates a lot of how people talk about their environments with each other.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked a lot about how much more challenging it can be to design lower power or sort of like floating power level cubes, where you just don't have that structure and you actually have the opportunity to make those decisions. It also means you are required to make those decisions. Like, if you wanted to take at that power level every single removal spell and just make the all removal cube, you can do that, but you need to find the balance, because obviously that wouldn't be a ton of fun.
So I want to look at these numbers real quick. Again, I did my main cube, your main cube, so the Bun Magic cube and the Regular cube, and I want to go through...
I was wondering when that was going to happen.
I think you should change the name to Regular. Make it the Regular cube. So I went through and counted, as best I could, hard removal spells, soft removal spells, counter magic, smoothing, which is all the cantrip, card draw, like any card that is in the cube specifically for card selection, card draw purposes. I did not count card advantage stuff that is not based around drawing cards there. So I didn't count like Eternal Witness in smoothing, even though it kind of draws a card, because it's not, it's not actually going to help your smoothing.
It's a little bit more situational.
Yeah, and like I said, all these buckets are really fuzzy, which is part of why this exercise, I think, is already a little bit fraught. I also counted hand hate, and then I have another category of just mana, which is any land that is primarily there for its mana production, all mana fixing, and then also things like mana rocks, but not mana dorks, because I felt like that was kind of a different category. So it's just cards that only produce mana and do nothing else, where a mana dork is also a 1/1 body and might do something else. The cards that just produce mana and sort of care about that. Those are all the categories I did. You said you think your cube is 23% interaction, and now which of those categories would fall under interaction?
That again, just going by memory, and if my numbers don't match yours, we can just say my memory is correct and I put things in categories differently, right?
Of course.
So that I was counting, I think, removal spells, bounce spells, so would count like Callous Dismissal and Pacifism, Seal Away, Oblivion Ring.
I counted bounce spells as soft removal for this purposes. And also in your cube, I also gave you the benefit of the doubt, and I counted combat tricks as soft removal, because that is kind of a use case for them.
And then obviously we have, in red, the burn spells, and black, the things that just say destroy target creature. I don't know about how to categorize things like wraths, and like you said, like balance is a hard one, but I have like Witch's Vengeance. Is that a removal spell? I guess so.
I counted the wraths as removal spells, and the ones like Witch's Vengeance as a soft removal spell, because they remove some things but not everything. And
Booster Tutor obviously goes into the smoothing category, right?
Absolutely. That is a very good cantrip, and I put it right into smoothing.
All right, I'm on the edge of my seat. What are these numbers?
All right, so for your cube, first of all, you have 412 cards, so I also have percentages for all of these things. You have 22 hard removal spells by my count, and 69 nice soft removal spells, for a total of 22% of your cube is some kind of removal.
Wow.
There is some slight overlap in some of those categories, like if a card, for example, a Braid is a card that I counted both as a hard removal spell for artifacts and a soft removal spell for creatures, but the overlap is very, very limited. There's only a couple like pieces of overlapping there in either of our cubes. So basically 22% of your cube, I think is some percentage of removal, which is very close to the 23% you remembered. So I think we added things up pretty similarly.
Nice.
Do you have any idea how many counter spells you have in your cube off the top of your head?
I'm going to guess 12.
You have 11. You're so good at this.
Oh, man.
11 for 2.5% of your cube. Now, how about smoothing? How many, and this is one of the fuzziest categories, I think. How many cards do you think?
Yeah,
I went through.
I've definitely thought of less. And I know there's a couple things with cycling. Let's go ahead and say 16.
I counted 58 things in your cube that had some kind of smoothing, card advantage, card selection component.
Then we're thinking about this differently.
Yes, I think we are. Yeah, that's anything like, any little creature that cantrips. Thraben Inspector I counted as a smoothing thing, for example.
Okay.
All those kinds of things. I counted 58 there, which is 14% of your cube. You have very little hand hate. Do you know how many hand hate cards you have in your cube?
I'm going to go with just 2, Duress and a Mind Rot variant.
You also have Kitesail Freebooter. You have 3.
And Freebooter, okay.
Yeah, so, 3, which is less than 1% of your cube. So if you add those percentages up, and again, these are not exclusive, so there's a little bit of overlap here, but that's about 40% of your cube that is, very roughly speaking, that is one of these just interaction things. Either hand hate, counter magic, or cantrips are in there as well. These are things that are not threats. They're not going to kill your opponent. They're not, how you're winning the game. It's not the strategy of your deck. It's like these little kind of bits and pieces that keep things moving. And then I counted 62 mana cards in your cube, which is 15% of your cube. And if you add that to the overall good stuff percentage we just had, you're at like 54% of your cube, so a little over half. That is these. I don't know how to describe these spells. I mean, like I said, they're kind of like the bread and butter of Magic. Not that they're necessary in every environment. You can totally have an environment with no counter magic. It's totally fine. But they are present in really every retail limited format that's ever existed. They're present in every constructed Magic format. Like, almost all Magic has these elements to it, and so that's kind of how your cube broke down. When you say
good stuff, I generally think of not, these kinds. Like, I think bread and butter is a less precise but almost better term, because when you say good stuff, I kind of just think of like, a huge 6-drop, like it's just powerful creatures and threats.
I think of good stuff as something that just always works in a vacuum, like doesn't need any kind of synergy or build around-y, doesn't require any synergy to get the value out of the card. Like, I would count Lightning Bolt as a good stuff card. It's like, this card is just good, it just does stuff.
And also on the mana cards, did that include lands as well, I'm guessing?
Yeah. That includes lands.
That makes more sense.
Pretty much all lands. Like, even lands with, like, the only lands I didn't count, for a spoiler, I also did these numbers for the Degenerate Microcube because it's a small cube and it was fast, and I thought it'd be interesting to compare because it's a radically different environment. The only lands I didn't count towards mana were, like, Dark Depths and Bazaar of Baghdad across both of our cubes, which are, like, lands that
even like Treetop Village you'd count?
Yeah, I counted Treetop Village, because, I mean, I think it is a land first, and then if you get to make it a creature, great, but I think it's primarily a land. Do you disagree? Do you think that's wrong?
No, I mean, in the case of, like, we're talking about how game plays, like, it's just sort of saying it's an upgrade from a forest is going to get me in trouble, but,
yes,
having more of those... I don't know if that really shapes games in a way from, like, the kind of mana you have access to in the way that, like, fixing and ramp does.
Well, yeah, sure. I wasn't trying to capture the amount of fixing or ramp you have access to. I was just trying to capture the raw number of cards in the cube that are primarily mana sources.
Okay, so because your goal in this case is not to talk about like how much ramp and fixing we have, but what density of these sort of just generic effects do we have?
Really what I'm doing is I'm doing all of this to try and determine the inverse. I'm curious what percentage of this cube doesn't fit into any of these categories. Like, these are the cards that are threats. These are the cards that are my proactive strategies. Really, almost all of this stuff, smoothing, maybe not as much, but everything here is like either reactive or it's like the grease that makes your deck work. It's the hand smoothing and the mana, like the stuff that you actually use to cast your spells. And so I'm really kind of curious to know like what the rest of the cube is. The reason I was doing this because from all the cubes I design or have designed to date, I want all these things to be present. And so the question is, really, if you consider all of this space we just talked about as like space that is not available to express the theme of the cube, for the most part, again, there are places where the theme of the cube overlaps with these categories. I'm curious to know, like, really how many cards am I trying to... If I'm trying to make a 360 card cube that's about Changelings and Tribal, how many cards do I actually need to make the entire cube about that, and then the rest of it can be this other stuff, and I still have it sort of be a very present theme. And so that's kind of why I was working backwards for these numbers.
Got it. Okay. So we're saying where did we land? Around 40% are in my cube are cards that don't fit into these kinds of categories you've described.
40% not including mana. If you throw in mana, it's 54% of your cube is all of this stuff, meaning 46% of your cube is the other stuff, the
right.
proactive threats.
All right, so how does that compare to your cube?
My cube, so my cube is a 360, so always drafting the entire cube. I have 36 hard removal spells and 80 soft removal spells, which puts me at like 32% removal to your 22% removal. Is that a surprising ratio to you?
No, that is not surprising.
I expected more of a disparity here than there actually was. I did not expect to find as many removal spells in your cube as I ended up finding. And again, I did count things like, Giant Growth as a soft removal spell, which is generous. But yeah, like 32 to 22, like not a huge difference, all things considered. But I do feel like our cubes play very differently in this regard. Like I feel like in your cube, you can much more reliably run a Baneslayer, a big threat that just dies to a removal spell, and not guarantee your opponent's going to have that removal spell. And in my cube, I feel like the exact opposite is true. Like running a big threat out with no way to protect it, or a threat that has no resilience to removal is a recipe for just getting it removed almost immediately. But at the end of the day, there's not actually that much of difference in the actual removal density we're running.
I mean, it's not a huge difference, but I think that difference is very relevant.
That's true. The other thing that's different, though, is also the kinds of removal spells that are in there. Because again, soft removal is a very big category. And even if you exclude stuff like Giant Growth, my removal spells are, pound for pound, a lot more efficient than your own removal spells. You have some removal spells at 4 and 5 mana, and I really have nothing above 3, and rarely at 3. Most of my stuff is 2 or 1 mana removal. And so it is also possible to have the densities be identical and still have the removal in the environment feel very different with regards to impact on the actual gameplay.
Yeah, I mean, there's no world where we can take these numbers to be, any more than a guideline or a first pass because of all these factors.
Right. That's something I thought was interesting. I think that it's actually the nature of the removal more so than the density of it that really accounts for that difference in gameplay between our cubes for the most part. Because, I mean, there's a difference. I mean, 10%, like, I have 50% more removal spells than you do, which is a difference, but it's not a huge gap. Having played both cubes a fair amount, I expected a bigger disparity there than there actually is.
Maybe another difference is also just in, like, the quality of the removal and how that ends up leading to the cards to be drafted and included in decks. Maybe I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself in terms of talking about, like, goals and the kinds of gameplay we're trying to get from each of these cubes, but I think a difference when you're drafting your cube is there is a diminishing margin on removal spells, so you end up just, having some in your sideboard maybe because you only want the 2 or 3 that targeted removal spells. Whereas in my cube, I think you do end up, it's a resource that you struggle for and want to get as much into your deck as you can.
Yeah, I think it definitely depends on the kind of deck you're playing. Like a control deck in my cube will play any removal spell it can get its hands on, pretty much without exception.
Mm-hmm.
The aggressive and mid-range decks, I do think have to balance a little more carefully, like threats versus answers, because if you run up against a control deck that has very few targets to your removal spells, you don't want to be stuck with a bunch of dead cards in hand. And so it is actually a sort of line you have to balance. And in terms of like how I balance removal in this environment, again, I never thought about these numbers. I didn't know what they were. But the gameplay I aim for is I do want it to be a decision. I don't want you to just say, well, I have to play all the removal I drafted because removal is good and I only got a certain amount of it. I want you to be sideboarding removal spells as much as you're sideboarding threats and like make it give my players like reasonable decisions to make over how much to main deck versus sideboard.
Right, yeah.
You want to guess how many counter spells I have in my cube? Remember, you had 11.
I'm going to guess 25.
21, very close. Almost 6% of my cube is just counter magic. How about hand smoothing? So all these categories of cantrips, card draw, anything where the fact that it draws a card is important to the card's identity and how it sort of performs in the cube.
All right, so you said it was 69 in my cube, which is a little bit bigger, and I guess yours
No, you had
is
58. You had 69
58.
soft removal spells. You had 58 hand smoothing spells.
So even though your cube is smaller, I think you're still going to be considerably higher. 80?
I had 59, just one more than you.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And obviously, given that these are pretty, rough buckets and that I made a quick pass, I probably missed a card or two. These are basically identical as far as I'm concerned. Different percentage because my cube is a little smaller, but we both seem to prioritize that kind of smoothing to make our game sort of run a little more cleanly. And then hand hate, you only had the 3. I have 10 pieces of hand hate in my cube, and that's a great example of a category of card that I would run so many more of these if there were more that were at an appropriate power level. I love hand hate for black and for black aggro and for its identity, like being a proactive answer to something before it's even cast, I think is a very cool space for black. But there's just not, like nowadays we get this effect at 2 or 3 mana, which is not competitive enough on rate for my environment. And so I'm really just playing the ones I can. And I would play many more of these if I had the option to.
Way off topic, but I really want to see you or someone else draft the hand hate deck in the Turbo Cube. There's so many ridiculous cards that are just like huge upgrades on Thoughtseize in that environment.
We can talk about this briefly. Here's my skepticism about that deck. It's so easy to completely dump your hand.
Needs to be on the play.
Yeah, it's so easy to just dump your hand, and then all those cards are effectively nullified and completely turned off. I mean, we played this cube last week, and I had a couple of games where, and this was, so we've talked about the Turbo Cube before, and some of our stories from the Turbo Cube are from drafts we did against bots, where the decks end up totally broken because the bots obviously don't know the Turbo Cube rules modification.
This is a cube where you get a discount of 2 mana, 2 generic mana on all your spells and abilities.
Yeah, so there's a bunch of cards in this cube, like Guild Globe, which is an unassuming common, which the bots probably don't look twice at, but is actually a double mox that draws a card, basically, or, it's a 2 mana ritual that draws a card, which is kind of messed up. So some of our stories come from those drafts where our decks are really busted. This was like basically human only draft. It was 6 humans, 2 bots. My deck was not broken. It had lots of, fair stuff, but still I had multiple games where turn 1, I ended with 1 or no cards in my hand and just dumped my entire hand. So I'm not high on hand hate in that environment because people don't have hands very often.
Yeah, that's fair. I definitely had some slower, grindier games in this particular draft than previous drafts we've done, though.
I'm excited to talk more about Turbo Cube. I think you should continue to iterate on and improve this environment, and then write a big article about it. That's what I'm going to
we have a long list of feedback to parse here,
and a long list of articles to write. So only so much time in a day. So all those numbers added up. Remember, you had 40% this category of cards in your cube. My percentage is like 57, which different, but not hugely different. And then mana cards, I do have a significantly higher density of mana fixing and mana cards in my cube. I have 69 of those, which is 20% of my cube. And so adding all these numbers up, your regular cube again was 54% of all of these bread and butter cards, and mine's 76% all these bread and butter cards, which is a lot. The most of the cube by a pretty big margin.
So what is the rest of your cube?
That last 25% is the actual threats, right? That's the creatures and planeswalkers and the occasional instant or sorcery that doesn't fall into one of those other categories. That's your proactive strategy. That's how you're going to win the game, is that those 25% of the cards, which 25% of 360 is math is hard. I'm going to do it real quick so I don't fuck it up. That's just 90 cards. So I think it really helps to highlight how much, even in a 360 card cube, changing a few cards can make a profound difference in how the cube plays, because only 90 of these cards are responsible for basically the entirety of any proactive strategy in my cube. Like all of midrange, all of aggro, and all of control's win conditions are all in that 90 cards across my entire cube.
All right, so we've done the numbers. Can I disagree with you yet?
Of course. That's what you're here for.
So I think there's 2 points that I think are worth highlighting. One is that we obviously have very different goals in terms of the kinds of gameplay we're looking for. And in my cube, it's a little bit more towards synergies and playing on the board kind of interactions. So it's intentional that the removal is tuned down a little bit, because while I want you to be able to have interactive games and have access to removal, it also I want it to feel like a meaningful and viable strategy to try and stick a couple creatures that are going to work well together. Does that make sense? And overall, do you feel like this cube has been successful in that?
Yeah, no, it totally makes sense. I understand that as one of your goals, and certainly having a lot of efficient removal would eliminate the possibility for people to combine Soul Diviner with Soul Herder. I didn't mean to pick 2 creatures with Soul in their name, but
the Soul Tribal deck.
These are 2 build-aroundy cards you have in your cube that would certainly fall off dramatically in value if everyone was packing efficient removal and could just turn them into vanilla creatures with no benefit.
The bigger thing that I disagree with, though, is I don't think it's fair to just split these cards and say, they're either these, theme synergy cards or they're these bread and butter cards. Because I think there's a tremendous amount of overlap. In the specific cube, we have sort of a little bit of a spells matter theme, and so obviously all of the removal, all of those, smoothing cards we're talking about, really are part of that deck. Similarly, if we have the couple heroic cards that we've talked about and things like Feather, and again, you'll want specific removal spells like Arc Lightning to go with those cards. And even some of these cards that you might think of as mana cards, well, there's lands matter synergies, or there's artifacts matter that makes you want this Chrome Star in this Renegade map. So I think there's actually very few cards that I would say are just like, oh yeah, this is just a good card that is sort of to form the background and doesn't really serve to reinforce any of these themes.
Well, yeah, I didn't mean to say it that way. I just meant that, like, even if you decided on what you want your themes to be and what you want your games to play like, you still need a certain amount of these kinds of things. Like, you wouldn't build a whole cube and then be like, get to the end and be like, oh, there's no removal, and, so I guess this is just a removal-less cube because that was my theme. Like, there's nothing to say that, like, these cards in these categories can't and shouldn't still be related to the underlying theme, but they still need to exist in a certain density. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. My point is just that these themes, like the game plays out in a certain way. The resource system, the kinds of interaction that exist, and the combat system are really fundamental to the game. But all of the themes that, Wizards has designed into their sets are part, like, they play within that system. So I don't think it's just two separate buckets. Like, not to say that this whole exercise isn't valuable. I think that the relative comparison between two cubes is still valuable, but I do think that it's good to be aware of the fact that that's a little bit reductive.
For sure. I thought I made that very clear up front, that I think this whole exercise is very fraught, which was my point. Yeah, it's very hard to put things in these buckets, and to your point, yes, they all overlap with the actual themes of the cube. But back to my original purpose of, like, asking this question. So right now for this tribal cube, I have a big pile of, like, 500 changelings and tribal payoff cards that are vaguely within a somewhat reasonable power band, and I have to basically whittle that down to decide how many of these, and these are all any kind of tribal card, but the vast majority of tribal cards are proactive. There's not that many tribal removal spells or tribal counter spells. There's some, not that many.
Nameless Inversion is the only one I can think of.
Oh, you got Crib Swap, you got Low Mage
Tarfire.
Mentor, you got, Tarfire doesn't actually really work with any of the tribal themes in the cube, but yeah, you got some. So I have to whittle this list down to figure out what is my, like, first pass of this cube going to be, how I'm going to cut all these cards and find just the good core that I really want to play. And after I do that, then I can go back and say, all right, now, what kind of removal makes sense for these cards that I've chosen, right? I'm not just going to basically stick in the same removal suite I have in my Bun Magic cube and say, well, great, that this removal just goes in every cube. I'm still going to choose them based on the themes of the environment and try and sort of balance them. For example, we talked a little bit about how in this tribal cube where you're combining cards in these weird ways, I think having a pretty high density of card selection and smoothing is very appropriate, because you're going to want to find the cards that go together and avoid the cards that are completely unrelated or, like, maybe have non-bows with each other, and put them together in this right way. So being able to actually have some agency over the cards you're drawing makes sense with the theme of the environment. Similarly, I think I'll be a little bit lower on the sort of numbers of hard removal spells, because I don't want people to get punished for doing a cool synergy thing, right? I want them to be rewarded. And so trying to find that right balance where the removal is at a density and at a cost such that people don't just lose to some resolved bomb, but they also still have an opportunity to put together little value engines and sort of combine cards in synergistic ways. Like, all this theme is going to be present in all of these decisions. But yeah, the whole purpose of doing this was just to kind of understand some rough baseline of, like, how many cards should I whittle down this pile of tribal cards to as a starting point, and assuming that I'm going to need X density of removal, counter magic, smoothing, hand hate, that kind of stuff. Which, I don't know, I think it's interesting to think about a cube that way. And again, I've basically never done it before. I've never designed a cube this way, and I find myself presented with this question with these more thematic cubes I've been working on and having a hard time figuring out how much to run.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting how tribal, like we've talked about it in the past, but it really does have this sort of parasitic issue, but it's almost more that it doesn't interact with a lot of these different aspects of the game. Like, it's very distinct from Spells Matter, which literally can just interact with all these other kinds of cards that you want in your deck anyway. Tribal is pretty narrow.
It does end up being somewhat narrow, although, like, these cards do touch other aspects. Like, I don't know, the reason I'm doing this is I'm actually building this cube because of all the conversations we had about tribal cubes, a couple months ago, and because I'm excited about the new changelings in Kaldheim. And I want to kind of definitively, hopefully, make this cube as a monument to the fact that tribal is not inherently parasitic. It is not inherently narrow. It can actually be very, very open, and I'm hoping to achieve that goal. I have no idea if I'm going to, but that's the goal I'm aiming for with this environment, is maintaining a very flexible environment where picks are fluid and your pick order changes, from pack to pack, and you don't get stuck in some lane and get sort of married to it, and demonstrating that Tribal doesn't have to be this kind of mechanic that forces you to draft on rails.
Right.
Do you want to know the numbers for the Degenerate Microcube? I'm curious to have you guess these numbers and see where I think you land. Let's ignore the let's just go to percentages, because I think that's easier than trying to do the math in your head for the size of the cube. So let's hard removals first. Button Magic Cube, 10% hard removal. Regular Cube, 5% hard removal. What percentage of the Degenerate Microcube do you think is hard removal?
I think it's weird, or it's difficult to pin down, because I want to say there's much more, but also because you have like these tiny decks, you have so much of your opening hand, or so much of your deck in your opening hand. Like, a very small number of cards can feel very present and very important to the game. But I'm still gonna, but there's also all these combo pieces that just eat up a lot of space. So wait, what were our other cubes?
Button Magic is 10%. Your cube is 5%. Regular cube, 5%.
Let's go crazy. Let's say 20%.
Split the difference. 7.5% if the Degenerate Microcube is hard removal. Soft removal, Button Magic 22%, regular cube 16%. What do you think the DMC is?
Let's stick to what works. Let's go 15%.
It's 16%. It's basically exactly the same percentage of your cube as soft removal. You made some interesting observations that are very true. Removal, not actually that great, the Degenerate Microcube. First of all, a lot of the ways you cheat things into play, you're cheating these very difficult to interact with creatures into play, and so removal doesn't always answer them. Mostly what you're trying to do, like the more kind of disruptive strategy, is just stop your opponent from doing their thing in the first place. And so, to that point, counterspell percentage, my cube is like 5.8, your cube is 2.6. What do you think the Degenerate Microcube is?
I'm going to go 10.
10%. It's, not 9.3%. 9.3% counter magic, which is obviously a lot. I mean, 10% of the entire cube. Here's an interesting one. Smoothing, my cube was 16%, your cube 14%. What do you think smoothing is in the Degenerate Microcube?
Let's go 5%. I think this is a similar one where you ended up cutting a lot of it because it just ended up being not as valuable as you expected.
Yeah, it is low. It's only 9%, which is, low, quite low. It's only 15 cards in the entire cube. And that's also being a little generous. So, like, I counted all of the little dinky artifacts.
Ancestral Recall smoothing?
Ancestral Recall is smoothing.
Is Time Walk
I counted Time Walk as a cantrip. Yeah, I did count Time Walk. But I also counted stuff cantrip. Like Scrabbling Claws, which is kind of generous, but, it does cantrip. Same with, all the spell bombs I counted as smoothing, which is, again, a little generous. So it's a gray area, but it's definitely not as much there. How about hand hate, Anthony? My cube was 2.7%. Yours was just 0.7%. The DMC.
I'm gonna go with 5%.
7%. 7% of the whole cube is some form of hand hate. And so the overall numbers there, is the DMC is actually exactly 50% these categories. And so mine was 57%, yours was 39%. This is 50. I think it's interesting how different each of these environments are and how these numbers are kind of like, I don't know, they're not super directly tied, I don't think, to how these environments play.
I mean, those are big differences. Like, the difference between me saying, well, this turn, is it worth me sticking my I hate to use this word, but stick my Baneslayer Angel when you're 50% more likely
you got to give Baneslayer Angel the vaccine. You got to stick it.
That is a big change in the evaluation of what an optimal strategy is if your opponent is 50% more likely to have a removal spell in their hand.
Those things don't, I think, translate to exact percentage of likelihood to have a removal spell. And again, the difference between the DMC and your cube was just 2%, 22 to 24% in terms of removal density. So basically the same density as removal in those environments, which, I don't know, it's interesting. Having run over these numbers, we had the experience of playtesting the Combat Trick cube, which is also a smaller cube. This one is actually, I just played around with a brand new size. This one's drafted in 2 packs of 16, and you build a 24 card minimum deck size deck. And we had the experience of, I filled that cube with combat tricks. There are so many combat tricks in that cube, and basically every single creature or threat relates to combat tricks in some way. It cares about its power, it cares about being targeted, it cares about casting instants and sorceries. It's able to protect creatures so that you can make your instants and sorceries and combat tricks easier to stick. All of these cards relate to that in some way. And I'm looking at the list right now. I've got probably half of this list is something you could categorize as a combat trick. And yet, all of the players basically of this on this draft, except for 2 of us, kind of drafted a deck that didn't care about combat tricks, which was very depressing to me.
Yeah, that was a little bit Sad to see you so disheartened. But it's interesting. We've talked about this challenge of designing at lower power level where we have this flexibility to make these sweeping choices. I feel like this was one of the first times you've really, really embraced that. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, probably. I mean, I've dirtled with a lot of cubes before, but not many of them get to the point where we actually playtest them. So yeah, let's say that this is definitely a very conscious toying with a lower power environment where I'm excluding a lot of cards for being too powerful.
And I think that really, really highlights how challenging it is. And I think it's really the difference is if you want to make the theme of the cube feel like combat tricks, it's not just about putting a bunch of combat tricks in there. It can even just be a very small dose of combat tricks, but making sure that you actually make those part of an optimal strategy. So you actually see them and they feel like they have a huge impact on the game. And even in my games, like, I played almost no combat tricks. I was trying to metagame a little bit too much and try and build a deck that would work really well against combat tricks. But I had a couple incidental, like, split cards and things that can function as combat tricks. And when they worked, that was extremely satisfying. So I feel like you're not that far from it, but really focusing on just making those moments where combat tricks are fun, also the really optimal strategy, even if that means decreasing their presence in terms of number of cards, is sort of the way to go and make it really feel like the combat trick cube.
Right, I've made a lot of changes since we drafted it, and I actually am a little excited to try it again, especially because we got a lot of really great cards in Kaldheim, just incidentally for this cube, like, I don't know, 6 to 10 really solid slam dunks, I think, for this environment. So yeah, I'm excited to try it again. I think some of the things that I took away from this were, and I felt this myself in, drafting the cube and also doing playtest drafts, something that I feel like is becoming important to me is making sure that whatever the theme of your cube is, I feel like should be the cards that you're most excited to pick early in the packs. And if you have a bunch of really high quality other stuff, it's not that people are going to like consciously avoid the strategy. It's just that they're going to say like, well, I'll take this card that's really good and really appealing to me, even though it's a removal spell or a counter spell or, a fetch land or whatever. And then, they just keep doing that because there's more appealing spells that can keep getting past them in packs. And before they know it, they have this deck that doesn't actually really take advantage of any of the combat tricks or like thematic goals because you didn't make it the most appealing thing to pick out of the pack.
Make the fun thing the good thing.
I'm keeping some very efficient removal in the combat trick cube because it is an environment, I think, where you need it because of the extremely high ceiling on some of these cards when you do get to do these broken combat trick things, which is me and one other player that actually drafted a deck that cared about combat tricks, and we had a really fun match with each other where I think this cube got to kind of shine in the way I wanted it to shine. Everybody else seemed like they had games where it was just normal Magic with occasional combat tricks because they had to play them. And even in those games, too, I do think that efficient removal is important, and giving your players the opportunity to remove something or choose what to use removal spells on is kind of important. But for the Changeling cube I'm dirtling around with, I am going to very consciously make the removal a tick lower power than all of the actual threats and tribal cards because I don't want people to be first picking Doomblade or Swords to Plowshares or whatever, because I want them to be thinking about their proactive strategy primarily when they're drafting that cube.
I mean, the removal is still fun. Like, it can relate to the tribal mechanics in that knowing, like, what is the correct lord and what's the right moment to remove one of their tribal synergy cards. Like, that very much is also enabled by that theme.
Right, exactly.
So I don't think it means you need to cut it all together, but you want to feel like you can take some risks and go in on these tribal synergies and not feel like you're just dead to a single removal spell.
And a lot of it is focused on the draft. Like, I still want very interactive games, and interactive is a big bucket. That can include a lot of things. That can include, interactive in the way that you choose to attack and block on a pretty big board, and, making ways to get in even when your opponent has a lot of blockers. But yes, even though I want to be really interactive, I do think that I'm just primarily thinking about that draft experience of, like, I open up a pack. I don't want people to be just saying, well, I'll put off making decisions about, I know this is a tribal cube, I'll put off making decisions about tribes and stuff until as late as possible and just keep taking all these good counterspells or whatever. I want them to say, well, geez, this cancel is pretty below rate for the cards in this pack, so instead I'm going to commit to this Aula Queen of Bears, or I'm going to commit to this Fathom Fleet Fathom Fleet Captain, the black one that you can make a token. Because I want them to be thinking about their proactive strategy, which is actually, like, that's another way that I feel like I have in the past articulated a difference of approach to cube design. We've talked about how when I'm adding or removing cards from my cube, I'm almost exclusively thinking about how those cards match up against the decks in my cube. Like, how does this match up against a really good aggro deck, a really good mid-range deck, a really good control deck? Like, which of these matchups is it dead in? Which of these matchups is it shine in? What's the kind of spread of that matchup? And very rarely thinking about, like, oh, what are the cool synergies this card has with other cards in my cube when I'm doing something proactive? And I think a lot of people, when they're designing a cube, they think opposite. They think, like, very proactively, because they're thinking about, honestly, I think that bias comes from inheriting a lot of cube design heuristics from deck building and designing a deck. When you're designing a deck, for a constructed format, you can maybe know exactly what the meta, looks like competitively and kind of figure out how it lines up against that. But you're oftentimes thinking kind of internally, like, how do I make this deck work within itself, and what are the synergies and, like, powerful relationships between the cards inside of it? And I don't usually design cubes that way, and so that's what I want the Combat Trick Cube and the Changeling Cube to be about. I want people to think about how their deck works internally, but then still have an interactive game of Magic afterwards.
I think, though, you can also, to counter that, like, create more of a background for that theme to sit against. And if even one or two of your colors really don't do tribal at all, but are still thinking about tribal exactly like you're saying, in that they are trying to build their deck in a way to properly interfere with the tribal synergies, it still feels like that can work and feel like the theme is still there.
I guess one thing that is easy for me, I find it very easy to explore cubes at extremes, right? Like, the Bun Magic Cube is kind of pushed aggro, mid-range, and control and fair strategies to their limit as much as I can. The Degenerate Micro Cube has pushed all degenerate and evil strategies to their limit as far as I can. And now I'm talking about these other cubes where I'm like, let me just try to go all in. Like, every card in the Combat Trick Cube, removal, cantrip, all of them relate to combat tricks somehow, or creatures that carry about combat tricks. Like, every single card is thematic. And same, I think, is going to go a little bit for this tribal cube. And I think you're right. I think you're totally right that oftentimes a theme can be felt sometimes more profoundly against a more mundane backdrop. But I find it very hard to, at least for a first pass, design a cube that makes sense for that. Like, it seems so easy to just design a cube and try to, like, strike this perfect balance and actually just totally whiff, and nobody cares about the theme, doesn't feel it at all. And then how do you correct? Like, do you say, I'll add 2% more and just keep adding a little more until it's actually felt? How do you account for the fact that every draft is anecdotal and, random to some degree, and so it might not necessarily be representative of how the environment actually would play across 100 drafts if you could simulate them? Like, I find it very hard to kind of strike that delicate balance in cube design.
And the player bias is also huge. Like, we can say, oh, well, the combat tricks actually weren't optimal because nobody wanted to draft them. It could be that they are, and we just didn't see them.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And that's another sort of factor there, is that I think, I do think the best decks that can be drafted from the Combat Trick Cube, even in the iteration we played before all my changes, when we played tested a couple weeks ago, I do think the top tier decks would be entirely built around combat tricks. It's just that no one drafted them, me included, because I was in my seat and trying to read signals and trying to do the best I could. I wasn't like just forcing the broken blue-red Wizards deck or whatever. It would take a lot of playtests, I think, to have any kind of confidence about what the actual dominant strategy was of a given cube environment.
Yeah, it's kind of weird how the playtesting, it both lets you shape the cube a little bit so that the signals you're trying to send to your drafters is there, but also, like, your players have things get like, if you're playing with a consistent play group, they'll see strategies get proven to them and they'll change the way they draft it, which is sort of a weird thing happening in parallel.
Cube design's hard. It's very hard to test these things and figure out how things work, and ends up very complicated, I think. I guess we will call it there. Thank you for indulging me in my my weird deep dive here, Anthony, about breakdowns of removal and counter magic in cubes and how it actually doesn't really matter. You can't count it that much. It's hard to actually categorize, and it's all fraught.
Is this weirder or deeper than any other week?
It depends how you're counting, Anthony. It's just like going through a cube and trying to decide what counts as soft removal. Entirely depends. This has been Lucky Paper Radio. All of our music is produced by DJ James Nasty. This week, we have a survey up for Call Time. Regular listeners and followers of us will know that we do a survey for every set as it is released. The goal is to capture cube designers' initial impressions and opinions of cards before they actually get a chance to test them in their cubes. I want to measure you. We care about your first hot takes. So if you go to luckypaper.co/survey/KHM, I will put the link in the show notes. You can fill out a brief survey Tell us what cards you're testing, and we will write up the results in a prospective article in a couple of weeks and share it with the community. Thank you, Anthony, for all your hard work on all of those survey things. Everyone should thank you for all the work you've put into that.
Yeah, of course. Happy to build some websites to make some cool graphs.
We're off to enjoy a beautiful day. Thank you for tuning in to Lucky Paper Radio, and thank you, Anthony, for talking about magic with me.
Thank you for talking about magic with me.